Welcome to the debate.
Usually, when we think about the biology of survival, we picture action, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The adrenaline rush, the sprint away from danger, raising your fists. It's cinematic, loud, measurable.
Right. It's the classic fight or flight response. It makes intuitive sense to us. If you are threatened, your body mobilizes to either, neutralize the threat or get as far away from it as humanly possible.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of complex relational trauma, and suddenly survival looks entirely different. It doesn't look like running or fighting. It looks like a smile. It looks like compliance. It looks like, extreme, unwavering agreeableness.
Yeah, it hides in plain sight. It looks like absolute selflessness and kindness to an outside observer, but underneath it is the absolute definition of terror. It's terror disguised as customer service.
That is such a good way to put it. Today we are examining the psychological and neurobiological nature of the fawn trauma response and betrayal blindness. Are these trauma responses fundamentally maladaptive pathologies, of self-abandonment that must be eradicated for a person to heal?
Or, and this is the crux of it, are they highly sophisticated adaptive evolutionary mechanisms? Things that are absolutely essential for survival and eventual post-traumatic integration.
Right. So I'll be arguing that fawning and betrayal blindness are profound, biologically embedded adaptations. They brilliantly preserve social connection and physical safety when fight or flight are, frankly, biologically impossible.
And I will be arguing that while these responses, may have offered essential short-term protection, they ultimately function as a pathology. They erode identity, they reinforce what Donald Winnicott called the false self, and they trap the survivor in a state of chronic nervous system dysregulation that, honestly, must be actively dismantled.
Let's lay the groundwork by looking at the pure evolutionary intelligence of the human nervous system.
Okay, let's do it.
If we look at Dr. Stephen Korge's polyvagal theory and Jennifer Fried's betrayal trauma theory, we see this brilliant biological override. Humans have a built-in cheater detection system. We are evolutionarily wired to spot when someone is taking advantage of us, lying to us, or, posing a threat. And our instinct is to reject them.
Right. We get a gut feeling of revulsion or anger. Exactly. But what happens when the threat comes from a caregiver or an institution that a person entirely depends on for survival? If you are a child and the person harming you is also the person providing your food, shelter, and, your entire social reality, you literally cannot afford to activate that cheater detection system.
Because rejecting them means you don't survive.
Yes. So the attachment system steps in and actively overrides it. Fawning uses pro-social behaviors, appeasement, flattery, compulsive caretaking to neutralize the threat. I really think we need to stop viewing fawning as a weakness or a character flaw. It is a biologically embedded survival tool. It keeps individuals alive in impossible, double-bind situations. I hear you. I acknowledge that fawning has immense utility in childhood when you physically cannot escape an abuser, or even in adulthood in situations of domestic violence where fleeing literally equals death. But we have to look at what it becomes when it crystallizes into a personality structure.
You mean long-term?
Yes, long-term. Fawning is fundamentally a pathology of self-abandonment. It forces the individual to construct a mask that eventually mutates into chronic people-pleasing. Society praises this as selflessness, but it's really self-erasure.
But wait, calling it self-erasure implies a conscious choice, right? A choice to abandon oneself?
Well, not a conscious choice, no. But the result is exactly the same. It creates that false self that Winnicott described. The person becomes a mirror, constantly reflecting back what they think the other person wants to see. And over time, this leads to emotional exhaustion, severe depersonalization, and complex PTSD. You just cannot achieve authentic connection or self-trust while your nervous system is compulsively managing everyone else's emotions to avoid conflict. To achieve true post-traumatic reconstruction, these mechanisms must be discarded.
See, I think you're jumping straight to the long-term pathology without fully appreciating the neurobiological speed and the absolute necessity of the adaptation.
How so?
Well, the amygdala, our brain's emotional smoke detector, scans for environmental safety or danger in a 200 to 300 millisecond window. This process, neuroception, it bypasses the conscious prefrontal cortex entirely.
Right, it's automatic.
Completely automatic. You aren't choosing to fawn. When your brain instantly calculates that you cannot outrun this person and you cannot overpower them, fawning is an automatic deployment of the social engagement networks. The body says, I will appease them to survive. It is a masterpiece of rapid, life-saving adaptation.
But that assumes fawning as a clean, healthy pivot to social engagement. And internally, that isn't what's happening at all. The person isn't just being, social. They are in a state of what clinicians call frozen agitation.
Let's pause there for a second, because we're throwing around terms like vagal states and frozen agitation. For someone not steeped in polyvagal theory, what is actually happening in the nervous system during that state?
Great question. So, the vagus nerve acts like the body's braking system. When we are safe, we are in a ventral vagal state. That's social, relaxed, connected. When we are in danger, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. That's fight or flight, the gas pedal.
Okay.
But if we are trapped, the oldest part of our nervous system takes over, the dorsal vagal pathway. This is the emergency brake. It causes immobilization, shutdown, dissociation.
Like a possum playing dead.
Exactly. Now, in the flawed response, you have frozen agitation. You have high sympathetic mobilization, massive amounts of fight-or-flight adrenaline, racing heart, racing thoughts, but it is overlaid with that dorsal vagal immobility. You are pressing the gas pedal to the floor while pulling the emergency brake.
Wow, so they're happening at the same time.
Yes. The outside looks calm, smiling, and compliant, but the inside is a physiological war zone. You have a racing heart mixed with heavy, paralyzed limbs and a profound inability to take decisive action. The nervous system remains chronically dysregulated, stuck in an incomplete defense cycle.
Okay, but think about how a complex operating system handles a critical error. Isn't the fawn response essentially like a computer entering safe mode during a catastrophic failure?
Safe mode?
Yeah. I mean, yes, it's highly restricted. Yes, it disables certain higher order functions like individual identity expression, boundary setting, and authentic anger, but it is the only way to prevent a total fatal crash of the organism. The frozen agitation you're describing is just the system containing the massive threat energy while keeping the vital life-sustaining functions online.
I actually love the safe mode analogy. It's perfectly apt. But let's follow that logic through to its conclusion. If you run a computer in safe mode for 20 years, the hardware degrades. You never get to use the actual operating system.
Well, sure, eventually.
You lose access to the prefrontal cortex's executive functioning. Your identity erodes, and your physical health literally deteriorates because of the chronic cortisol and adrenaline pumping through your system. Which brings us to the cognitive side of this. Safe mode isn't just behavioral. It alters how you perceive reality.
Right, because to maintain the fawn response, you have to actively not see the danger right in front of you. This is Jennifer Freyd's betrayal trauma theory. Freyd makes this crucial distinction between high betrayal and low betrayal trauma. If you are betrayed by a stranger in an alley, a low betrayal trauma, you can process it, get angry, and run away. But a high betrayal trauma involves someone you rely on. Betrayal blindness is an adaptive dissociation.
It's selective amnesia, is what it is.
It is, but for a vital reason. I mean, if seeing the truth about the person or institution harming you threatens your actual survival, your brain selectively forgets or minimizes the abuse. Think of it like the physical blind spot in your eye.
Oh, where the optic nerve connects.
Exactly. Where your optic nerve connects to your retina, you literally lack photoreceptors, but you don't walk around seeing a black hole in your vision. Your brain seamlessly fills in the missing pixels with surrounding information so you can keep functioning. Betrayal blindness does the exact same thing for abuse. It fills in the gaps. It's an evolutionary triumph that allows a child to still accept food from a parent who hurt them the night before.
An evolutionary triumph that completely unmoors a person from reality. I'm sorry, I cannot revere this blindness because it merely delays the inevitable. The bill always comes due. When the survivor finally exits that abusive environment, when they finally reach a degree of physical independence, the brain realizes it no longer needs the blind spot.
The pixels drop out.
The pixels drop out, the blindness lifts, and when it does, they experience what clinicians call the second crash.
Right, the post-exit discovery phase.
Yes, and it is arguably more devastating than the initial abuse. This isn't just remembering bad things, it's a profound psychological fragmentation. We have to look at Ronnie Janoff-Bullman's shattered assumptions theory here. Humans naturally need to believe three things to function: that the world is generally benevolent, that events are meaningful, and that the self is worthy.
And betrayal shatters all three.
Instantly. When the betrayal blindness lifts, that entire assumptive world is destroyed. The survivor has to retroactively rewrite their entire autobiographical history. If my mother wasn't actually loving, then what was my childhood?
It's an ontological shock.
A complete collapse. And because they've been operating in safe mode, they are incredibly vulnerable to institutional DARVO.
Actually, for our listeners, could you explain exactly how DARVO weaponizes that vulnerability?
Sure. So DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim and Offender. It's a manipulation tactic used by abusers. When confronted, they deny the behavior, attack the person confronting them, and then flip the roles, claiming they are the actual victim.
Right.
Now, if an abuser does this to someone with a healthy nervous system, that person gets angry and walks away. But if the abuser does this to someone coming out of betrayal blindness, someone whose reality is already shattered, whose false self is programmed to appease, it is a targeted strike on their sanity. The abuser says, "I never did that. You're crazy. And actually, you abused me." And the victim, lacking ego strength and boundary-setting practice, thinks, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the problem.
Okay, but the second crash only happens because the betrayal blindness kept them alive long enough to reach safety. It was the scaffolding that held the fragmented pieces of the psyche together until the environment was secure enough to process the collapse. And when that collapse happens, it sets the stage for a profound evolution.
I'm not sure a total psychological collapse is an evolution.
It is if you view it through Kazimierz Dąbrowski's theory of positive disintegration. Dąbrowski argued that psychological tension, anxiety, and even severe crises are absolutely necessary for growth. The collapse of the fawn response and the lifting of betrayal blindness is not just recovery from an illness. It is the necessary disintegration of a lower psychological structure to build a higher one.
So the shattered assumptions are just, what, growing pains?
In a way, yes. Before the restructuring begins, survivors often enter a gray phase. It's a period of intense emotional numbness, essentially a profound dorsal vagal shutdown. But rather than viewing this as mere pathology or a failure to cope, Dąbrowski's framework suggests this is a metabolic conservation state. The nervous system is resting. It is preparing the ground for the true self to finally emerge.
Okay, I agree that the true self is desperately trying to emerge, but the mechanism for that emergence is what we really need to focus on. To move out of that dorsal vagal shutdown, that gray phase, and get back to a healthy, regulated state where you feel safe and connected, you have to climb the polyvagal ladder. You can't just skip from shutdown to happiness. And what is on the rung right between shutdown and safety?
The sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight energy.
Exactly. To heal, you have to move through the fight response. Healing requires a rage counterattack. The biological preparation for aggressive defense was thwarted during the original trauma because the person had to fawn to survive. So as they awaken from the dissociation and climb that ladder, they experience intense, seemingly disproportionate anger. That anger is a biological necessity. It is the tool required to shatter the false self and finally establish the interpersonal boundaries that fawning completely erased.
But wait, aren't we romanticizing anger here just a little bit? Let's look at the real-world implications of this. In a clinical setting, a 35-year-old lashing out with the unregulated pure terror and rage of a 5-year-old destroys marriages. It destroys careers. It alienates support systems precisely when the survivor needs them most.
It's messy, yes.
It's beyond messy. We usually view this kind of explosive anger as a symptom of PTSD that needs to be managed or dialed down. Are you genuinely suggesting that this destructive, terrifying rage is actually the first clinical sign of the cure?
Yes, unequivocally. I mean, it is the golden shadow, to use Jungian terms. For decades, their survival relied on making sure everyone else in the room was comfortable at the expense of their own existence. The anger is the nervous system finally saying, I am allowed to exist and I am allowed to defend myself. It's a biological initiation. If we pathologize that anger, if we medicate it away or tell them they need to calm down and be polite, which by the way is exactly what their abuser told them, we trap them in the trauma response. They have to process it somatically to complete the defensive cycle they were never allowed to finish.
If we accept that this rage is a biological necessity rather than a symptom to be medicated, it completely upends how we treat it in the clinic. We can't just talk them out of it.
Precisely. Talk therapy alone often fails complex trauma survivors for this exact reason.
But, we do have highly efficient cognitive models that work without requiring massive, prolonged somatic upheaval in every case. Let's look at written exposure therapy, or WET. This is an incredibly effective evidence-based intervention.
WET is fascinating, yeah, but how does writing bypass the somatic lock?
Well, WET works because it forces the brain to slow down and structurally reorganize the memory. When a trauma occurs, it gets stored in the emotional, chaotic, nonlinear right hemisphere of the brain. The body feels like the danger's happening right now.
Right, but when you force a patient to write a detailed narrative about their trauma focusing on thoughts and feelings, they have to use their prefrontal cortex to construct sentences. This logic pulls the memory out of the chaotic right brain and anchors it into the logical, chronological left brain. It achieves a massive PTSD symptom reduction in just 5 30-minute sessions with no homework.
That is fast.
It's highly scalable. When paired with trauma-informed systems that prioritize safety, it allows the survivor to process the trauma without necessarily having to burn their life to the ground in a state of extended rage.
Okay, WET is highly efficient for specific, single-incident traumas. I will grant you that entirely. But for deep, relational, fawning for betrayal trauma spanning decades, 5 sessions of writing is simply not enough.
You don't think it scales up?
No, because when your entire nervous system is wired to abandon your identity to appease an abuser, you're dealing with deeply entrenched negative underlying assumptions, or NUAs.
Core beliefs about the self.
Foundational beliefs. Things like, if I make a mistake, I am fundamentally a bad person, or my physical safety depends entirely on your approval of me. To actively restructure those NUAs, you really need therapies like cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and particularly EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
But hold on a second. If fawning is fundamentally a biological autonomic nervous system response, a neuroceptive override that happens in 200 milliseconds, doesn't cognitive processing therapy risk treating it as merely a cognitive distortion?
How do you mean?
CPT is about challenging irrational thoughts, right? But the survivor's thought wasn't irrational. It kept them alive. It seems to completely miss the somatic reality that the body still believes it is in mortal danger. You cannot outthink a survival reflex.
Which is exactly why EMDR is the vital bridge and why it is the gold standard for this. EMDR doesn't just treat the cognitive distortion, it actively changes how the brain stores the somatic memory. Think of a traumatized brain like a deeply messy closet.
Okay.
All the memories and emotions are thrown on the floor in a huge pile. Whenever you open the door, everything spills out all at once. That's a trigger. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation, usually eye movements tracking side to side or alternating taps.
And how does that actually organize the closet?
It taxes the working memory while mimicking the biological mechanism of REM sleep. By activating both the right and left hemispheres of the brain back and forth, it allows the brain to pick up one memory off the floor, the emotional right brain, put it on a hanger, and place it neatly on the rack in the logical left brain.
Oh, I see.
It neurologically integrates the event, allowing the nervous system to finally recognize on a bodily level that the threat is in the past. You need that bilateral processing to safely move a client through the rage counterattack so the closet door can finally close.
I definitely see the immense value in EMDR bridging that gap between the somatic and the cognitive. But I still return to the underlying premise of how we view the patient's adaptations. If someone is listening to this right now and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their entire personality, their kindness, their agreeableness, their constant peacemaking is actually a trauma-induced fawn response? I mean, that has to be incredibly destabilizing. How do we approach this dismantling without just inducing a massive wave of shame?
I think that is the most important question we can ask today. We strip away the shame by acknowledging the absolute truth. It kept them alive. We can and we must respect the origins of these responses. The false self was a heroic defender of the inner child.
It really was.
But to honor that survival, we must ultimately recognize the fawn response as a profound barrier to living an authentic life now. True post-traumatic growth, reaching that higher level of Dombrowski's development, requires thanking the false self for its service and then letting it go. It requires enduring the necessary, righteous rage of the polyvagal climb and reclaiming the boundaries that fawning erased. Survival is simply not the same thing as living.
Well, we have to summarize by holding both truths simultaneously. The fawn response and betrayal blindness are profound evolutionary achievements of the human nervous system. They are the protective scaffolding that allows traumatized individuals to survive the unsurvivable. They step in when fight or flight fail, holding the fragmented pieces of a person together, and their assumptive world is shattered, keeping them alive until it is physically and psychologically safe enough to begin the deeply difficult work of integration. We really have to revere the biology of that grace period.
And we won't declare a definitive winner today, because both the biology of survival and the psychology of authenticity are necessary phases of a human experience. The tension between the two is a lifelong negotiation.
For anyone listening, we suggest you reflect on your own nervous system's adaptations. Where are you fawning? Where are your boundaries? We highly encourage you to dive deeper into the source material on polyvagal theory and betrayal trauma to understand your own physiological responses.
Absolutely, because understanding the mechanism is the first step out of the trap.
You know, we started today by talking about how survival is usually pictured as running away or fighting back. But sometimes when you look closely at the muddy waters of relational trauma, you realize that survival doesn't always look like running. Sometimes, the bravest and most terrifying thing a person can do is finally allowing themselves to stop smiling.